Howdy, friends. Welcome back to Feedstuffs 365. Andy Vance joining you as we kick off another week of programming and digging into some of the big topics and issues in agriculture. Today, we're going to be talking about trade and the importance of trade, specifically in the dairy industry. Joining us to talk through some of the options, opportunities, and challenges is President and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, Krysta Harden. Krysta Harden, of course, a longtime leader in the agriculture industry, having served quite a number of years at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, including a stint as Deputy Secretary, a long time working at the National Association of Conservation Districts, stops in industry as well. Krysta, thanks for joining us on Feedstuffs 365. As I noted, your role now focuses largely on trade in the dairy industry. We know trade's important, so let's start top of the page with maybe an update, 30,000 foot overview, if you will, of what the export situation looks like for U.S. dairy as we head into 2023.
Well, thank you, Andy, and it's good to be with you and all your listeners and viewers. And I'm glad you didn't go through all of my resume because it makes me feel old when I hear all the different jobs. But this one is great. This is terrific. It's a really good time for dairy and for dairy exports, frankly, in spite of the headwinds, that are happening with trade. Is difficult coming out of COVID. The recovery around the world has been mixed. Obviously, we have inflation issues, shipping, supply chain issues. But in spite of everything, dairy exports, we're seeing some bright spots. And really, as we look to the future, we know that there's a lot of good times ahead for dairy exports.
I want to think about the role the U.S. plays in the global trade picture relative to other parts of the world. We know we're not the only country that exports dairy product, but in comparison to some of the other spots around the globe where they also produce these products, does the U.S. dairy industry have any specific advantages over other countries that are worth highlighting?
Yeah, I believe we do. And I will say, we're the third largest exporter around the world. The EU and Oceania, New Zealand probably comes to a lot of folks' mind. They're 1 and 2. We're number 3, but we're catching up. And we're nipping at the heels, I would say, of New Zealand and Europe, because we do have a lot of great benefits and opportunities ahead for our industry. We produce a great high quality product, high value product that the world is learning more and more about and wants and needs, frankly, to help nourish. We also have, we were out front on our commitment to sustainability and being an environmental solution. So others are having to catch up, I would say, to the goals that were set by the dairy industry, that commitment not only to the halo of the good, nutritious products that we have, but also being produced in a sustainable way. And again, being good for planet, we're good for community, we're good for people. Those are the attributes I think consumers worldwide are looking for, they need, and they want, and the U.S. is ready to supply those. Andy, your audience probably didn't realize when U.S. Dairy Export Council was created by dairy farmers 27 years ago, we were only exporting 2 to 4% of our total production, very domestically driven. And we still are. It's still the workhorse for our industry. But our population is more stable. We have dairy in just about every home in some form in the U.S. So because our farmers are efficient, because they're so productive and they want to produce more, they know they can be part of this nourishing in a food insecure world, we have more product than we're going to use here. And we're now exporting almost 20% of our production. So there has been this gradual growth, but a steady growth in the last few years, and focus on how do we play at the global market? How do we help, feed a very hungry and, food insecure in many places world?
I think dairy has a great story to tell there for a variety of reasons. I guess I'm a fan as a consumer of dairy products myself. But I want to dig into some of the market conditions. One of the things you mentioned earlier that piqued my curiosity was talking about some of the supply and demand challenges, supply chain challenges in particular. But I'm also thinking about when you talked about Europe being one of the largest export regions, how the conflict in the Ukraine with Russia's invasion and so on might have impacted the current U.S. exports of dairy products in the world markets. Are there significant market conditions or issues that are influencing what the U.S. dairy industry is able to do abroad?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'll start with supply chain because it is one that I think is on front of mind for a lot of different folks, no matter where you are in agriculture. Coming out of COVID, we saw a lot of our vulnerabilities. I think they were highlighted during the pandemic with supply chain. We ordered a lot as the American public. We had a whole lot of imports, and it became cheaper for these ships to come from Southeast Asia, from China, around the world, not wait once they've unloaded their products for consumption in the US, will not wait to be loaded to take agricultural products, including dairy, back to their markets. They would return empty. That was actually more cost effective for these carriers than to wait to take our products. So we had a lot of hiccups early on coming out of the pandemic. All of us suffered quite a bit. Our industry, we're estimating $1.5 billion in lost opportunities as well as additional costs. That's hard to recoup when you're trying to export. Congress did their job. They passed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act. The president signed it. That has made a difference. There's some other steps the administration made that help us, creating pop-up, areas around major ports. We've seen some real improvements this season that we didn't have last year. But again, it's Band-Aids. We're going to have infrastructure investment, more of a comprehensive looking at the supply chain. We still have issues with truckers, the lack of truckers. We've heard that on the news, many of us, about truckers who retired during COVID, didn't come back. Nobody now wants to do that. We also have the potential rail strike. Fingers crossed it's not going to happen. But throughout the supply chains, there are points that we're all concerned about, depending on where you are in the country and how close you are to a major port city. So that's something that's high on our radar. You mentioned the war in Europe with Russia and Ukraine, very difficult for the Europeans, obviously, with energy, with the cost of goods for them and production costs. We feel it here, as well. You can imagine the Europeans feel it. And there's also environmental pressures and different philosophies about how to deal with those in Europe. So there's a number of factors that we're all dealing with: inflation, currency. There's a lot of different things that we're trying to juggle to make sure that we stay, ahead of them and able to be competitive in the global market.
Taking all those kind of supply chain hiccups and macro, well, I'll say some of the macro issues, maybe more broadly geopolitical issues, into context, what's the supply demand picture look like around the world right now in terms of what's available relative to what the consumer wants to buy and where they're able to get it?
Well, there's certainly demand. There is no doubt about it. Dairy and dairy proteins and ingredients are very much in demand, but there is a tight supply for a variety of reasons, input costs being a large one. Certainly from here as well, our farmers are very cautious about ramping up production, ramping up herd size because of the cost and the uncertainty of markets around the world. And even the nations that want and need dairy and dairy products, the dollar is very strong, so their purchasing power of U.S.-based products does not go as far. So this is, it's really finding that right balance for our customers. We do have customers who are wealthy nations who are willing and able to buy our products, and we're grateful for them. But this has got to even out as we're coming out of recovery. Nations are dealing with inflation. They're dealing with the changes we all have gone through around the globe, finding the right balance. In the meantime, we're still holding our own. We're still growing in our exports. But again, there's some headwinds we have to work through.
And friends, if you're watching and listening to our conversation, have questions for Krysta Harden, President and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, just drop those into the comments section wherever you happen to be viewing this. If it's at feedstuffs365.com or one of our social media channels, do please leave your questions here, and we'll get to as many of those as we can in the time we have allotted. Krysta, you mentioned growth, so let's focus in. I always love to think about opportunities. Where do you see the most significant growth potential for U.S. dairy exports?
Well, I'll start by saying Mexico has traditionally been our largest market. They're our nearest neighbor, to the south, and they love U.S. dairy and dairy products. So value-wise, that is our biggest market, and I know that we'll continue to have opportunity in Mexico. Our largest in volume is Southeast Asia, and there's tremendous opportunity there as well. We're also seeing, potential in many of the other parts of the Americas. We had a farmer mission to Chile this fall. There are new, kind of growing, emerging market, if you will, in Chile for U.S. cheeses. It's a high GDP, a lot of purchasing power there. Brazil is a growth area for some of our ingredients. And other countries, Colombia comes to mind, in South America as well. Central America is also starting to show some interest in U.S. products. The Middle East and Northern Africa have, a lot of potential there. That was a good market for us in the Middle East during COVID. We're holding our own there. I'd like to see more growth there. Japan, Korea, very stable markets for U.S. products. They're steady eddies for us. We can count on them for a number of products. And China is probably the one that, is the outlier a little bit. It comes and goes. There's a lot of different issues going on in China. You just tune in to any kind of newscast and you're going to hear about what's happening in China and the recovery, or maybe lagging recovery happening there, and geopolitical issues there as well. So I would say we have so much opportunity as the world becomes more stable, comes out of COVID, the recovery, dealing with inflation and currency issues. Some of the markets and regions I just mentioned is what we're most hopeful for.
Yeah, that inflationary discussion is one that's really interesting, I think, when it comes to food generally, but within specific, again, I think, dairy has a great story to tell there in terms of the value, if you will, the nutritional value of dairy relative to the cost is maybe an opportunity for the industry writ large. I want to go back to some of the supply chain issues we were talking about a moment ago. You mentioned the ocean situation, container availability, and so on. I think folks are really well versed in what that story looked like over the past 2.5 years. We're maybe on the cusp of a rail strike. Certainly that's what a lot of us are watching closely. How closely are you and your colleagues watching that situation, and what concerns do you have about any potential disruption to rail lines having an influence on the dairy export supply chain?
Well, it's a grave concern. A lot of dairy is produced in the middle of the country. I don't have to tell anybody watching this program to know that at the heart of the U.S. and the way to get to ports in many cases is by rail. So it is of concern what might happen. Very hopeful to see the administration, the president himself engage in this effort. We remain optimistic there won't be a strike, but it would be very difficult for, I think, all of our economy, and certainly in agriculture, where a lot of goods are transported on rail. And we, without a strike, we feel like there's limitations at times on some of the short lines, on the more remote areas that we need to get product from. So I'm hoping longer term, we're looking at this infrastructure and railroads in general. But we need to get through this, tough, rough spot right now with the system, and hopefully can look at the bigger picture down the road.
Yeah, I'm not sure how closely the average U.S. consumer really watches this sort of thing or understands how significant that might be to the economy. And if we thought inflation was fun, a rail strike might really make it a good time. Let's go back to some of the things you alluded to earlier with regard to policy and the role policy plays in being able to create or at least facilitate opportunities for U.S. dairy exports. What's going on out there that you're watching that might positively influence or negatively influence, I suppose, export opportunities in the U.S.? What are some of the current trade policy issues that are top of mind for you and your colleagues?
Well, first of all, we need trade agreements. We have not had a major trade agreement, not in the Trump administration and not in this administration either. So that is something that we talk a great deal to USTR, to USDA, to the White House about needing trade agreements. Our competitors, Europe, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, they're negotiating trade agreements all the time. They're getting better situations, if you will, with market access than we have in key markets. So we're already at a disadvantage in those markets if our competitors are getting a break through strong trade agreements that we do not have. So we strongly encourage, underlining that word, this administration to be more aggressive and more active in trade agreements. Enforcing the ones we have is also very critical, and they hear us on that. We're holding other countries to their commitments as well. But also, what I say to our industry, let's take advantage of the trade agreements we do have, where we have favorable situations in many countries. Let's make sure that we're taking full advantage where we already have that better situation. Some of the Americas we already do. I think of Peru, I think of Colombia, I think of Chile. We already have trade agreements. We need to be taking full advantage of places, and then be asking for other opportunities as well in Southeast Asia and other countries.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I was thinking about when you started talking about trade agreements and the fact that it's been quite a long time now since the U.S. has been involved in any, it's a real change. It felt like the first 20 years or so I covered this industry in fairly bipartisan fashion. When it came to agriculture, at least, there was this recognition, Bush administration, Obama administration, of the importance of trade agreements and so on. And that has really changed. Has the industry, as the U.S. agriculture industry, I guess in specific, held its ground, I guess, in this drought, if you will, since the last trade agreements were negotiated? Have we lost ground when you talk about taking advantage of the agreements we already have? What's that now, gosh, multiple administration period looked like in terms of how we've taken advantage or not of those opportunities?
I'll speak just, for dairy first and maybe agriculture more largely. It is difficult, and it's getting more difficult. And I'll say for us in Southeast Asia, where our competitors really are having very robust, very aggressive stances towards free trade agreements, and we are getting left behind. We will be at a very big disadvantage in many of the 16 countries in Southeast Asia, which, again, you heard me say, our largest market to date right now in volume. So that is a grave concern. We have held our own in other places. We again need to take it full advantage where we can, where we have agreements, and also make sure that they don't expire. That governments, as they change administration, still honor those commitments. We have to, it's a continual process, and it is amazing to me. I've been in town a long time. You've alluded to that. And working in agriculture, and trade has always been synonymous. We were always part of the trade, to give the imbalance, on the positive side, for trade, because we're a great exporter, and we, that is something that is, I guess, maybe we took a little bit for granted, that would always be understood and would always be there in the administrations. But the last 5.5 years, you've seen a shift. A real different way of thinking about trade. Is not the proactive, positive word that it used to be, where we could actually come together, cross the aisles, work together, region by region, commodity by commodity, and really hammer out positive trade agreements for U.S. agriculture. And I think all of us in agriculture are recognizing what's at stake if we continue down the path. Farmers for Free Trade is a group we're a member of. A lot of commodities are involved in that, really educating farmers, reminding them, hey, you're so good, you're so productive, you're so efficient. The rest of the world wants and needs products from this country. And it's about new markets. It's about growing demand for your products that we are not going to be able to, to do in the U.S. because our population is what it is. Very small growth. And we are just so good at what we do. And, there's a lot of, philanthropy involved in this as well. We have products that others want to buy, and we should make sure that they're able to get them in a competitive way. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart. That's one reason this job interests me so much, not only with dairy and working for a great industry, but knowing we can help nourish. And it's not just about feeding people. And I hear that and I kind of bristle a little bit. It's about nourishment. It's what we're doing actually helps people, avoid diseases. It helps them, with immunity issues. It gives them the stamina that they need through nutritious products that we're producing in the U.S. And, hungry people, they're going to do kind of different things. We've seen that. We don't want to have hunger. We want folks to be able to have the foods that, like dairy, that we produce in the U.S.
I love that perspective. It's not just about calories, but living well. That's I appreciate you sharing that. And what irony that when I asked you about challenges and opportunities, you mentioned Southeast Asia first, and the last multilateral that we were even thinking about working on was in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe a good callback, an example for why those agreements are important. Let's, as we finish up our time together, Krysta Harden, what will it take, in your opinion? Earlier, you mentioned being number 3 in total dairy exports. relative to our competitors. Some future time down the road, you're coming back on the program and you're celebrating, hey, Andy, we are now the #1 exporter for dairy products in the world. What will it take to get to that future state? One, is that the goal? And if so, what does that future look like? How did we get there?
Well, it's up to us as an industry. I believe that with my whole heart. It is truly up to the U.S. dairy industry. That includes, processing. We need capacity to produce products as well. We need our farmers on the farm. We need the next generation see an opportunity coming back home, staying at home, staying on those dairies to be able to continue to produce, this wonderful product that we can share with the world. It is up to us because we don't have some of the same confinements and concerns that you'll see the Europeans and the folks in New Zealand, unfortunately, do have, where their government's policies are a way to help the environment is just to limit the number of cows. Or herd size and production size, where in the U.S. we have a different philosophy. We're like, we can do this with our cows. We can continue to produce this great product. We're just going to do it in a more sustainable way. We're investing in research. We're investing in new practices, new technologies, and genetics. We are doing this the right way, I believe, to be able to continue to thrive in the U.S. industry. We can take advantage of less production, smaller herd size from our biggest competitors. Somebody's going to have to step up because the world does need these products. I believe it can be and should be the U.S. That we're going to fill some of the void and the gaps that will come as some of our competitors produce less and are not able to grow in the manner that I believe we can.
Huge opportunities abound. Look forward to talking with you about that future on down the line. Thanks for being a part of the conversation today. Krysta Harden, President and CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council, joining us here on Feedstuffs 365. Friends, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, it is a great week of programming here. I want you to come back and join us tomorrow and Thursday. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about research out of the University of Minnesota, looking at diet composition and the U.S. geographic region significantly affecting greenhouse gas emissions. Some new research out from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Jerry Shearson and some of his colleagues will be back to join us. That's tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel. And then on Thursday, we'll be talking about furthering soybean meal through the Soy Innovation Challenge. Some friends from the United Soybean Board and the Yield Lab Institute will join our Sarah Muirhead to talk about some continued research and development in that space. You don't want to miss either of those. As always, 2 Eastern, 1 Central. While you're at Feedstuffs 365, reading about those upcoming live sessions or watching any of our past programming on demand, I want you to make sure you register for a pair of webinars we're hosting next week. We'll be hosting a webinar Tuesday on nutritional mitigation of early life stress in dairy calves and swine. Then on Wednesday, we'll be talking about profitability and sustainability of dairy farms and how we can improve that by balancing rations for amino acids. I want you to make sure that you join us for both of those. You do need to register. We'd ask you to do that by clicking on either webinar at feedstuffs365.com. And of course, if you haven't read the latest issue, the digital edition of Feedstuffs is available at feedstuffs.com. Just click on digital editions for more coverage of what's happening in the animal agriculture and livestock feed industries. Until next time, I'm Andy Vance for Feedstuffs 365, wishing you a great rest of your day.